And welcome back. We are now going to go ahead and get ready to do a little bit more world. I went ahead and added another resource here. You can see we have the turn here because maybe I want to have some turns. So I made myself kind of a nice figure 8 neighborhood here that I can kind of go ahead and work in. This is, of course, going to be available for you if you want to use this one. You could, of course, skip to using just the intersection and straight roads if that's what you want to do. But ultimately, we want to make some kind of path that we're going to use to really kind of get a good feel how our world's going to work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit. I'm going to collapse some of these things here so I don't have to have them looking at right now. And I want to focus right now on the main camera. So I'm going to bring my game menu back up here. And what I want to do is I'm going to split these here so they're kind of more side by side just so we can kind of see these two elements. And what I want to do here is kind of show you if I move this camera around, we can get it to kind of go to different areas of our map. But what we ultimately want this to do is not necessarily move the camera directly, but move the camera with the car. So as the car drives, the player is going to be able to have that camera move with them. All right. Now, that, of course, is going to require a little bit of work here for us to do. Now, one little thing I am going to point out real quick is that if you look at my world right now, we do have kind of this blue background here. And, that's fine for us to work with. But I did want to point out here, if we're in our main camera, if you look here, we can see our background is right now set to this blue color. If I want to change this to something like maybe grass, I can just bring that right up to kind of more of a green tinge. And I can play around with that too. I find a color that I think is going to work best. And I think this is pretty good right here. And that's going to give me kind of more of a green kind of landscape for that to drive around with. Now, of course, again, you can change it to a different color. Maybe you want to have nothing but concrete around here. So you could do that as well. But I just want to point that real quick before we jump into the coding. Now, we know we're going to be working here in our scripts folder, and I'm going to need to make a new script, but I have to think, what am I actually going to attach this to? Which object is this going to be part of? Because, of course, we have collisions, we have drivers. Well, if we look at our player car, we have that driver script. So that is, of course, affecting this object. But if we think about what is going to be moving around here, it's actually going to be our camera. Camera's the thing that's going to be moving around. So that's the thing we're ultimately going to want to attach this script to. So I'm just going to go ahead and come in here and right click. Let's go ahead and create a new C# script. And you can go ahead and name this something like follow camera, camera follow, however you want it to name it. But I'm just going to go ahead and have this be camera follow. All right, because that's what it's going to do. It's the camera, it's following it. And remember, no spaces in here because that can cause some issues here when you start doing scripts with multiple names in here. So avoid putting spaces in here because when you go ahead and make this script, so I'm going to go ahead and just open this up now in Visual Studio. One of the things you will notice is that Visual Studio and those C# scripts do not like having those pieces in here with spaces. Because you look here, it says camera follow. If you put a space in here, it's actually going to break this. Like if I put a space in here, you can see how this becomes two different words and it actually gives me an error. So I'm going to actually undo that. But want to make sure that you point that out because I have seen where people say, oh, well, this is not a big deal. And then in their Unity, they have a script with a space in it. But then up here, there's no space. And again, that can cause some issues. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. I'm going to go ahead and just remove our start comment here. So let's just go and get rid of that because ultimately we just want to update the camera. We're not necessarily starting the camera to do anything, but we just want to update it. And instead of saying update call once per frame, let's go ahead and make that a little bit more relevant for what we're doing. So we're just going to say updating the camera position to follow the player car. All right, because that's what we want. If we think about what we're updating again, in our main camera here, all right, because we're going to be moving this around, we think about what are we changing? What are we affecting? Well, we're affecting the positional values here of that object. And just to make sure we do this now, let's go ahead and add component. And I'm just going to go ahead and add that camera follow script. And you can either type that in or you can drag and drop that in there. But just so let's go ahead and attach that to your camera. And since we know we're going to use position and transform, we're going to need that in our script. So here in my update method, we're going to do our transform. We've seen this before, dot position. And you can see it's asking us to do something. We're going to not put that in right now. We do want to go ahead and have that equal something. But what are we having that equal? Well, we want to equal really the position of the player's car, right? And this is what's called making a reference. So we're going to reference a different object, the player car, and say what is their position because we want them to move relative to one another. All right. Now, we don't know how to get this right away. So what we actually are going to do, we're just going to comment this out for a second here. Just so that we can not have to worry about that little error in there. Instead, what we actually want to do is add a serialized field, because we want to pretty much have the flexibility to change this to different objects, for example. So we're going to put a serialized field in here, and we're actually going to make this of type game object, because we want to specify that it is a game object type, and not necessarily, like a string or a char or anything like that. And then we have to give this a name. So let's just have this be like follow player car. And you could call it anything else, like thing to follow or anything like that. You can name it whatever you want. I would always recommend that these names are very relevant to whatever you're having to do, because it's going to make it easier for you as you start making a game that's much more complex. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that real quick. And if I'm back over here in Unity, let me just collapse the camera there. If you look at my camera follow script, one thing you'll notice is it says follow player car. Okay, great. What does follow player car do? Well, if you look at it, it says none, game object. This is saying, hey, I want to follow a object. So I'm just going to click that little circle here. And it's going to bring up a list of all the different objects I have within my game. Well, if you remember, I created an object I called mine player car. Yours might be something different. I'm just going to go ahead and select that. And now it is going to be tagged to this player car. Now, this is not going to make it follow the player car yet, but it is simply just going to identify that this is the object we want this to follow. Now that we've set up that serialized field, we have a little bit more of what we can do, so I'm going to uncomment that. And I'm going to set this equal to, if you notice, it's being real helpful here and telling me, hey, you want follow player.transfer? Yes, I do. All right, and now this is not necessarily 100% of what I want, but this is a good start for us to be able to do this. If I look at this in Unity, how this is behaving, so let me just make sure this camera is kind of set right here. And let's go ahead and run our game. One of the things we'll notice is that, our main camera is all green. What happened here? It's because I said that, remember how I said the background here of this? So we may have to, I'm just going to go ahead and... Now, our assumptions here of something might be going on is not a bad assumption. But what we're actually going to do, if I'm going to pop back into the game real quick here, and of course we get that green screen, and if I untoggle this 2D tag, one thing you'll notice is that the camera is actually sitting on the top of the player. It's actually the exact same spot. So what we're seeing is the green background that we had set up earlier. So I'm going to untoggle that and unstop my game real quick here. And as you can see now, we can see I have a perfectly normal preview. But what we want is effectively this player camera and the player need to be on two different zones here. We need to change that Z level. All right, and of course, we can, manipulate this here, but the problem is, even if I change it here, once that game starts running, because it's updating, it's automatically going to move that camera to the player position. So we have to go ahead and change a little bit of our code in order to do that. So again, in here, we have it set exactly the same position, so we need to add to it some value. Now, you might just say, okay, well, we could just do like -10, but if we just add -10 here, that's not going to work. You can see we get an error. And that's because this is actually relying on a vector here, specifically vector3. So I'm going to do a new, all right, because we have to use that keyword here to tell Unity that we want this to do a new position rather than reuse the same one. And you notice it's suggesting here a vector3, so that's great. I can just grab that. And then I can go ahead and use parentheses. Well, think about this. How do we want this to be? Well, vector3s use an X, a Y, and a Z. So if I want this to be exactly the same spot, but I just need it to come up, then I'm going to leave the X alone. I'm going to leave the Y alone. And I'm going to change Z. So if we say, let's say -10, and we want to see how that's going to work, if we save this now, pop back into Unity, go ahead and rerun our game. And one of the things we'll notice is that now, we have our game now. We have that view that we want to see, because you see it's not all zoomed right in, and everything looks to be working the way we want to. And you notice as I start driving, that camera is now following that player car around. So we have a lot of good work there. Awesome. Now there is one thing here with my car. If I, am driving this, you might notice that sometimes we get a little jittery. So for example, if I try driving this and I just do maybe some smaller drives, it may not necessarily have a good correspondence with how these are going on. You might get some jittering too, or other things you might see that start to happen here. Now, how can we fix that? All right, we can make our camera actually a little bit better, a little bit more responsive. And the way we got to do this, we have to go back to our code and we have to rely on Unity's execution order. So in Unity's execution order, this is the way that Unity will work. You can see how it always works is there's an initialization process, then it works to the editor, there's another initialization process, it loads all the physics, does any input events, processes game logic, scene rendering, gizmo, GUI, etc., etc. Now, if we look for our existing update method in here, you'll see that exists right here in game logic. And what that means is it's going to update it here, but then any other kind of behaviors or any other logic that's going to happen are going to happen after this update. And because it's happening after this update, that could affect our camera because we do have other things that are happening in here, particularly when we start working with like some of those transforms. So there is a way to, of course, change it. If we look a little bit further down our game logic, one of the things you'll notice is this other thing called late update. And late update, of course, you notice is one of the last things that happens before it moves on to scene rendering. So if we change that to late update, that should help solve any jittering that we have with our camera. So all I'm going to do is just literally change this from void update to void late update, save that, and that will fix that issue. And so now with that late update in play here, we of course have a lot smoother camera. You can see we've kind of cleared out some of those jitters. They may not be as noticeable now. I mean, they weren't too bad before. But again, using the late update process is a little bit nicer for us to kind of go ahead and eliminate some of those potential issues with camera.